The human eye's dynamic range is incredible, being able to detect a single photon of light or 10 billion. The human ear contains as many circuits as the telephone system of a large city. A king of Israel named Solomon wrote that the hearing ear and the seeing eye were both made by God. However, are we to believe him? Can we trust the Bible, especially since it's supposedly full of contradictions? It's my case that the Christian faith is not blind. So please listen with your ears, eyes, and heart open as this episode of Skeptic of Doubt covers what a contradiction is and why the law of non-contradictions is itself justified. Forensic science is the use of scientific methods or expertise to investigate crimes or examine evidence that might be presented in a court of law. Although I doubt you need a degree in forensic science to crack this case. Have you ever dialed the wrong number? Or worse yet, were unaware that you even made a phone call? Occasionally, people can make phone calls accidentally when they have their phone in their back pocket and they shift their weight. This practice is known as butt dialing. In fact, the Oxford Language Dictionary has a definition for this term that goes as follows. Butt dialing is when you inadvertently call someone on a mobile phone in one's rear pants pocket as a result of pressure being accidentally applied to a button or buttons on the phone. Did you know that criminals have called 911 on themselves? That's right. Two individuals by the names of Nathan Teklemarian and Carson Reinhardt were about to burglarize a car in Fresno, California, when evidently one of them must have shifted their weight. To their later dismay, the phone was butt dialing none other than the emergency number 911. The dispatcher came on the line and asked, "What is your emergency?" When she did not get a response detailing an emergency, what she did hear for the next 35 minutes was a dynamic duo discussing how they were going to break into the car that they had found. The dispatcher heard, "Get the bolt and give me the hammer just in case," followed by the sound of glass smashing. As they drove away, they noticed that a police car was following them, prompting one of them to say, "Wow, what the expletive did I do?" They were pulled over and our pair was charged with breaking and entering, possession of stolen property, and conspiracy. When the officer explained to them that they had butt dialed 911, one of them stated, "This phone really called 911? Expletive." I guess that really is the best way to sum up that story. But there's another key takeaway I want you to note. These two unintentionally used the emergency number and got themselves into trouble because of that. Conversely, when we're using terminology like the word contradiction, it's essential that we are intentional and as thorough as we can manage in defining the term, because defining terms is a huge part of a communication. We need to understand the words we are using and then apply them correctly. When we last looked at the definition of the word contradiction, we had defined it briefly as an affirmation of a denial or a denial of an affirmation. In other words, two people, two statements, two reports, or two research results are contradicting one another when one affirms what the other denies, or when one denies what the other affirms. For example, if a forensic investigation report detailed that suspect X is 6 feet tall, and then another forensic investigation report detailed that suspect X is not 6 feet tall, these two statements, without any qualifiers or further context, are contradictory because the second statement is explicitly denying what the first statement affirms. However, further context might reveal that these statements are not contradictory. Say, for instance, the statements were revised to suspect X appears to be 6 feet tall when wearing stilts, and without stilts, suspect X no longer appears to be 6 feet tall. These statements are no longer contradictory because neither is affirming what the other denies. Both statements recognize that, when suspect X dons their stilts, their height appears to be 6 feet tall. Even though these statements are different, they're not in contradiction. However, there's more to what a contradiction is than just that. The Oxford Language Dictionary gives 3 definitions of the word contradiction. Let's take a look at them. Our first definition defines a contradiction as a combination of statements, ideas, or features of a situation that are opposed to one another. The second definition defines the word as a person, thing, or situation in which inconsistent elements are present. Our third and final definition says that a contradiction is the statement of a position opposite to the one already made. As you can see from our first and second definitions, there are a few elements that we need to consider when we're defining the word contradiction. We've already seen that a contradiction is an affirmation of a denial or a denial of an affirmation. So for example, the butler was hired last year and the butler was not hired last year are contradictory statements without any further qualifying information. And speaking of further information, there's actually one more definition of a contradiction that we're going to look at. The definition that is used in logic. Aristotle said, "It is impossible that the same thing can at the same time both belong and not belong to the same object and in the same respect." A modern and formalized rendition of that definition is that a contradiction is A and not A at the same time and in the same relationship or sense. A what? A is a representation of any truth claim. It's sort of like the letter X that was used as a stand-in for the number in algebra. So A is a truth claim or a proposition that can be either true or false. Not A is the opposite truth claim of the truth claim A. So A and not A can be represented by saying, it is the case that, and it is not the case that. For instance, to use our example from earlier, when was the butler hired? Since a combination of A and not A is always false, the statements, it is the case that the butler was hired last year, and it is not the case that the butler was hired last year, are contradictory statements. Another important point I want to highlight is that, as we saw in our updated definition of the word contradiction, is the timing of two statements can be crucial in determining whether or not they're contradictory. Say someone living in the year 2022 were to hire a butler. The following year, in the year 2023, they make the statement, it is the case that the butler was hired last year. The statement is true, of course, but now say 10 years pass and it's the year 2033, and the person who hired the butler is reviewing their years of faithful service, and now if that same individual was to say, for whatever reason, it is not the case that the butler was hired last year, they're not contradicting the statement that they made in 2023 because these two statements are in reference to different time periods. Finally, as I mentioned before, A and not A are contradictory when they are referring to the same time and I want to emphasize this, are in reference to the same relationship or sense. So what is meant by the same relationship or sense? Take, for instance, the word lemon. The word lemon can refer to the sour, yellow citrus fruit, but it can also be used to refer to an automobile with a substantial defect that the automaker can't fix within a reasonable amount of time. So the two statements, it is the case that a lemon is a citrus fruit, and it is not the case that a lemon is a citrus fruit, would not be contradictory if the second statement, you were using the word lemon to refer to a car that's been giving you some trouble. While we're still on the subject of cars, there are two more topics that are crucial to cover while we define exactly what a contradiction is, because these ideas are often confused with the concept of contradictions. We've already seen that compatible differences are not contradictory. For example, my car is a lemon and my car is compact are not contradictory statements because those two things can be true at once. Those differences are compatible, not contradictory. Likewise, if this compact lemon pulls up to a traffic light, the light's either going to be red, green, or yellow. If you were to state the traffic light is green or the traffic light is red, those statements would be contrary, not contradictory to each other because the traffic light could be yellow. Compatible statements and contrary statements are not the same thing as contradictory statements. However, what exactly is the problem with contradictory statements anyway? We've looked at what they are, but how do we know for sure? How can we be certain that contradictions are always wrong? The United States website, usa.gov, has a page called Commonly Requested U.S. Laws and Regulations. This page has information on business, child welfare, consumer protection, controlled substances, debt, education, health, and more. These laws can be updated, changed, revised, however you'd like to say it, they change. However, there's another set of laws that are unchanging, universal, and immaterial. These are the laws of logic. We're going to be covering what some of these laws are and how they apply to resolving alleged Bible contradictions. But for now, we're going to take a look at what is called the Law of Non-Contradiction. In brief, the Law of Non-Contradictions is simply that there's no such thing as a contradiction that is true. Contradictions are always wrong. More formally, the Law of Non-Contradictions is that A and not A cannot both be true in the same time and in the same relationship or sense. Contradictions are necessarily false. The law of non-contradictions exists. That fact is crystal clear. The question is, why is there such a thing as the law of non-contradiction? How can we know for certain that contradictions are wrong? For starters, the law of non-contradiction cannot simply be a description of the way that the human brain thinks. To add to that, if the law of non-contradictions truly is just a convention, a standard that we have collectively decided to uphold or deem to be accurate, then who is to say that anyone's truly being contradictory? Why can't someone have a different convention of the law of non-contradiction? After all, conventions, such as whether one drives on the left or the right side of the road, can differ. The law of non-contradiction also cannot be explained from a pragmatic or experiential approach. It is useful, that's true, but why is the law of non-contradictions true? The experiential approach doesn't fare any better because while you and I may have never had an experience with a true contradiction, what if there's somebody who is? Or what if there's somebody who will? We're left with the hanging question, what grounds do we have for believing the law of non-contradiction? It seems like the law of non-contradiction would need to be grounded on a foundation that is self-consistent and universal. The biblical God provides a foundation for the law of non-contradiction. The Apostle Paul in his epistle to the Hebrews and his letter to Timothy stated that God does not lie and that he cannot deny or contradict himself. We know that the law of non-contradictions isn't arbitrary because God is not arbitrary. And we know that the law of non-contradictions is universal because God himself is omnipresent. When you think about it, this is quite the interesting turn of events. For the Bible to have contradictions, the law of non-contradictions must be valid. But for the law of non-contradictions to be valid, the biblical God must exist. If you keep in mind the things that we spoke about today, like the fact that it's important to use terminology correctly, that whether or not statements are contradictory depends on multiple factors, and that the law of non-contradictions has its basis justified by the biblical God, then you should be a skeptic with a whole new way of looking at doubt. When pressed from all sides with hostile questions about your faith, it might be possible that you may feel doubt. Rather than being ashamed or letting your faith slip away, why not doubt your doubt? Instead of being overwhelmed by doubt, why not question your questions and test your tests? Unbelief should be subject to the same level of scrutiny and investigations that faith is commonly put to. I encourage you to doubt your doubt. Be a skeptic of doubt, and remember, the truth saves.